He signed the divorce papers on the same night his wife told him she was pregnant. Grayson Vale didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He slid the envelope across the kitchen table like it was a routine filing, poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, and said, "The timing isn't ideal, but we both knew this wasn't working." Elena stood there holding the ultrasound photo with both hands, the way you hold something you're terrified of dropping, and she didn't cry. Not in front of him. That was the thing about Elena Rowan. She never gave him the satisfaction of watching her break. He walked out at 9:47 p.m., got into his car, and drove straight to Vivian Ashcroft's penthouse. If you've ever watched someone choose money over a person who loved them, really loved them, without conditions, without an agenda, then you already know how this story ends for him. But you don't yet know what it costs, and that's the part nobody talks about. Stay with me until the end of this story. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Grayson Vale destroyed, you first have to understand what he had. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Baltimore with his mother, a woman who ironed her church clothes on Sunday nights, even when she had nowhere to go on Monday. His father left when Grayson was 6, not dramatically. No fight, no goodbye, just gradually stopped coming home until one day the absence became permanent. His mother never badmouthed the man. She just worked 2 jobs, kept the lights on, and told Grayson every single night that he was going to be somebody. He believed her. That was both his greatest strength and eventually his most dangerous flaw. Grayson put himself through undergrad on a combination of academic scholarships and weekend restaurant work, then clawed his way into Harrington Law School on pure stubbornness. He wasn't the smartest student there. He'd be the first to admit that, but he outworked everyone. While other students went to bars on Thursday nights, Grayson was in the library rereading case briefs he'd already memorized twice. His professors noticed. So did the recruiters from Whitmore and Crane, one of the most prestigious corporate litigation firms in the country. He got the offer. Accepted it at 11 p.m. from a payphone outside the library because his cell had been disconnected. Walked back to his apartment and ate a peanut butter sandwich standing over his kitchen sink, because that was all he had, and felt for the first time in his life like the ground beneath him was solid. He met Elena 3 years later. She was a legal aid attorney working out of a converted storefront on the east side of the city, representing tenants facing illegal evictions, families fighting wrongful termination claims, single mothers navigating a family court system that wasn't built with them in mind. She had a caseload that would have broken most people in half, and a filing system that was, charitably, creative. Grayson had been sent to depose one of her clients, a landlord dispute that had gotten tangled into a larger corporate matter, and he arrived in his tailored charcoal suit expecting a pushover. Elena Rowan was not a pushover. She met him at the door with a yellow legal pad already filled with notes, told him he had 45 minutes because her next client was coming at noon. And when he tried to rattle her client with an aggressive line of questioning, she cut him off mid-sentence. "Counselor, that question assumes facts, not in evidence. Try again." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look up from her notes. He asked her to dinner that evening. She said no. He asked again 2 weeks later. She said no again, but she smiled this time, just slightly, at the corner of her mouth, and he filed that away as progress. The 3rd time he asked, he showed up at her office with coffee, the right order, because he'd paid attention, and said simply, "I've been trying to impress you for 2 weeks and nothing's working, so I'm just going to tell you the truth. I think you're the most interesting person I've met since I got to this city, and I'd like 1 hour of your time." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the coffee. "1 hour," she said. They talked for 4. She was the kind of woman who made you feel like your best self was the minimum expectation, not some aspirational ceiling. Not because she demanded perfection. She was openly impatient with pretense and had zero tolerance for people who confused confidence with arrogance, but because her own standard of integrity was so quietly consistent that mediocrity felt embarrassing in her presence. She'd grown up in Georgia, raised by a grandmother who kept a garden and read novels, and told Elena from childhood that her mind was her most valuable asset and that any man who made her feel otherwise wasn't worth her Wednesday, let alone her lifetime. She meant it, and Elena had absorbed every word. They dated for 2 years, married in a small ceremony in her grandmother's backyard, actual backyard, plastic fold-out chairs, and a cousin who played guitar, and Elena in a cream dress she'd found at a consignment shop and altered herself. Grayson's colleagues from the firm sent lavish gift baskets and quiet, curious looks because Elena was not what they expected of Grayson Vale, ambitious rising star. She wasn't polished in the ways they recognized. She wasn't performing anything. She was simply and completely herself, and it made some of them deeply uncomfortable, which Elena noticed immediately and filed away without comment. The early years were genuinely good. Cramped apartment, student loans still bleeding them dry, Elena's legal aid salary barely covering utilities, Grayson grinding 80-hour weeks at the firm. But good. They cooked together on Sunday nights. They read each other sections of whatever they were working through. They fought about money and dishes, and which of them had agreed to call the landlord about the radiator, and made up in the honest, unglamorous way that real people do. Grayson made partner at Whitmore and Crane at 34, the youngest in the firm's history. And that was when things began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. It wasn't dramatic it was subtle, the way rot is subtle. You don't see it until it's structural. He started working later, attending events Elena didn't know about until he mentioned them afterward, offhand, already dressed and leaving. He started talking differently at home, not in a way Elena could easily name, more like the register of his voice had changed, like he was performing even in their living room. He bought things without discussing them. He corrected her once, just once, and immediately caught himself, when she used a phrase he found unsophisticated in front of a colleague at a firm dinner. Elena noticed all of it. She wasn't naive and she wasn't quiet. She brought it up more than once, in the clear-eyed way she did everything. "Grayson, I feel like you're somewhere else lately." He would apologize. Things would ease for a few weeks. Then the drift would resume, slightly further than before. She told herself it was the pressure of the partnership. She told herself he was adjusting. She told herself the man she'd sat across from for 4 hours on a first date, the one who'd said, "I want to be honest with you," before she'd given him a single reason to, was still in there somewhere underneath the custom suits and the new vocabulary. She wasn't entirely wrong about that, but she was wrong about what he'd do when it came to a test. Vivian Ashcroft entered his orbit at a charity gala in October, one of those polished, cavernous affairs where the cause is secondary to the networking and everyone knows it. Vivian was 31, Stanford MBA, daughter of Clifford Ashcroft, whose company, Ashcroft Capital, controlled enough real estate and financial infrastructure in 3 states that his name was spoken with a particular kind of care by people who understood what it meant. She wore white at a gala full of black, and she wore it like she'd written the dress code. Grayson was there representing a client. She started a conversation with him about a zoning litigation case he'd won 18 months prior that had apparently made the rounds in her father's circle. She knew the case in specific detail. She asked intelligent questions. She laughed at the right moments and went quiet at others in a way that felt like she was actually listening rather than waiting to talk. He drove home at midnight thinking about that conversation. He told himself it was professional interest. He was still telling himself that 3 months later, when the texts started arriving past 10 p.m. and he began deleting the thread before he put his phone down on the nightstand. Elena found out the way most people find out, not from surveillance or confrontation, but from a small, dumb accident. A name on a calendar notification that appeared on the shared tablet while she was looking up a recipe. Dinner. VA on a Thursday, he'd told her he had a late client call. She didn't rage. She didn't cry. Not yet. She sat in the kitchen for a very long time with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, running through the last several months with the precise, organized mind she applied to everything, and understood with a sick, clarifying certainty that she hadn't been paranoid. She'd been right. She'd been right every time she'd felt the ground shifting and told herself she was imagining it. She waited for him to come home. When Grayson walked in at 11:30, smelling faintly of somewhere else, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the lights fully on. She looked at him, said his name once, and then told him, in a level voice that was 10 times more devastating than shouting would have been, exactly what she knew and exactly how long she suspected it had been going on. He didn't deny it. What he said instead, what she would replay for years, turning it over in her mind during her worst moments, was this. "Elena, I care about you. But I need you to understand that there are opportunities in front of me right now that I can't walk away from, and I have to be honest about what that means." Opportunities. He used the word opportunities. She told him to get out of the kitchen. He tried to say more. She could see him organizing some further explanation, already in lawyer mode, already building his case. And she just said very quietly, "Grayson, don't." He left the room. They spent 3 weeks in the same apartment saying the minimum necessary to function. She saw a therapist. He worked late. She started looking at legal clinic positions in other parts of the city, just to have options drawn out in front of her, tangible things she could move toward. Then, on a Tuesday evening, she came home with a paper bag from the pharmacy and stood in the bathroom for 3 minutes that felt like 30, and the test came back positive. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub. She thought about her grandmother's garden. She thought about a lot of things. Then she went to tell Grayson. He was at the kitchen table with his laptop open when she walked in holding the test. She put it on the table in front of him and watched his face. He looked at it, looked at her. She saw the calculation happen. She actually saw it, the flicker of assessment behind his eyes. And her stomach dropped because she'd spent 5 years learning to read him. And she knew, in that moment, before he said a single word, what he was going to choose. "Elena, don't explain it to me." Her voice was flat. "I can already see what you're thinking. I just needed to see it on your face." He stood up, ran a hand through his hair in that specific gesture she'd always found endearing and now found intolerable. "I never wanted to hurt you. I want you to know that." "You're hurting me right now," she said. "While we're standing here, you're doing it right now and you've already decided you're going to do it more. So don't talk to me about what you want me to know." He moved out within the week, signed the divorce papers on a Thursday, the same night she'd shown him the first ultrasound photo she'd gotten printed at the pharmacy, the small cloudy image that she'd been carrying in her jacket pocket because she didn't know where else to put it. She'd shown it to him not as a plea, not even as an appeal, just as information, as truth, as a real thing that existed in the world because of choices they had both made, and that was going to continue existing regardless of what he decided. He slid the divorce papers across the table. He said, "The timing isn't ideal." Then he poured the scotch and left. She didn't watch him go. She stayed at the table with the ultrasound photo in her hands and listened to his car start, listened to it back out of the driveway, listened to it pull away down the street. Then it was quiet. Just the refrigerator hum in the rain, beginning on the roof, and Elena sitting in the kitchen of an apartment that was too big for one person in a city where she had built more than he'd ever noticed, holding a photograph of a life that had just become entirely her own responsibility. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put it very carefully in the inside pocket of her jacket, right against her chest, and she got up, rinsed her cup, turned off the kitchen light. She had a 7 a.m. court appearance and a client who was counting on her. There would be time to fall apart. There would be plenty of time for that. But not tonight. Tonight she had work to do, and she had always, her whole life, been very good at work. Across the city, Grayson Vale pulled into the underground garage of Vivian Ashcroft's building, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for exactly 43 seconds. Then he got out of the car, straightened his tie, and walked toward the elevator. He told himself he felt certain. That was the first lie he told himself that night. It would not be the last. The elevator doors opened on the 32nd floor, and Vivian was already there, leaning against the doorframe in a silk robe the color of champagne, holding a glass of red wine she hadn't touched. She looked at him the way someone looks at a painting they're considering buying, appreciative, assessing, not entirely committed. "You're late," she said. "I had things to handle." She stepped back to let him in. He walked past her into the penthouse, which smelled like cedar and something expensive he could never identify, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city below. All those lights, all that distance between himself and where he'd started. "Did you sign them?" she asked from behind him. "Yes." A pause. He heard her set her glass down on the marble counter. "Good," she said. Just that. One word, flat and clean, and something about the way she said it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up for exactly 1 second before he talked himself out of the feeling. She came to stand beside him at the window, close enough that her shoulder touched his, and she looked out at the same city with an expression he couldn't read. "My father wants to meet you, properly. Not another gala handshake, a real meeting. Dinner at the house Friday." "I know." "Do you understand what that means? What he's offering?" Grayson looked at his own reflection in the glass. "I understand." Vivian turned to look at him directly. Grayson, do you understand what he's offering? He turned too. She was watching him with those pale eyes that always felt like they were reading something he hadn't said out loud, and he held her gaze. Full partnership in the Ashcroft Capital legal structure. Access to the Meridian development deal. A seat at the table on the Holloway acquisition. Not just access, she said, control. If you play this correctly, you become indispensable to my father's operation within 18 months. That's not a ladder. That's a different building entirely. She picked up her wine. But my father doesn't do favors for men with complicated domestic situations trailing behind them. There it was. The first time she'd said something that landed with its full weight. He felt it in his chest. Not guilt, something more structural than guilt, like a load-bearing wall under stress. It's handled, he said. Is it completely handled? Because Marcus Fielding told my father's assistant that you and your... She paused, chose the next word with care. That there are still financial matters unresolved. Marcus Fielding needs to stay in his lane. Marcus Fielding is my father's head of legal affairs, and his lane is roughly 100 miles wide. She set the wine down again. I'm not asking to be difficult. I'm asking because Friday matters, and I need to know where you're standing. I'm standing right here, Grayson said. Everything else is logistics. She studied him for another moment. Then she nodded, once, and the conversation closed like a door. She moved to the kitchen and he turned back to the window, and the city kept burning below him, indifferent as always. He stayed the night, lay awake until 3 in the morning with the ceiling above him and Vivian breathing evenly beside him, and thought about a kitchen table, a photograph, a cup of tea going cold. He pushed it down. He was good at that, had trained himself to be good at that. This particular kind of internal compartmentalization that law school had refined into something close to an art form. You put the thing in a box. You close the box. You focus on what's in front of you. He closed the box. By 4 a.m., he was asleep. Friday arrived with the specific texture of days that matter. Overcast, a little cold, the city moving with its usual velocity, but everything carrying an extra weight. Grayson wore his best suit, the charcoal Brioni he'd bought himself the month he made partner, and he drove to the Ashcroft estate in Westchester with his hands relaxed on the wheel and his jaw tight in a way he wasn't fully aware of. The house was what it always is when old money decides to express itself, restrained on the outside, overwhelming on the inside. The kind of place where everything is beautiful and nothing feels comfortable. A housekeeper showed him into a dining room that seated 12, even though there were only 4 of them. Vivienne, her father Clifford, her older brother Preston, and Grayson. And the 4 of them sat at one end of the table like they were conducting a deposition. Clifford Ashcroft was 71 and moved like a man who had never once been in a hurry, because hurry implied that someone else controlled your schedule. He had white hair, a handshake that communicated exactly how much he needed to impress nobody, and eyes that sat a little too still in his face. He was perfectly pleasant during the appetizer course. Asked about Grayson's firm, his caseload, the Baltimore origins. Asked the questions like he already had the answers, and was simply checking them off a list. Preston ate quietly and watched. He was 43, thicker than his father, and he had the specific quality of a man who understood that he would never be the smartest person in any room his father entered and had decided to compensate with surveillance. Every time Grayson said something, Preston's eyes moved to his father's face to check the reaction before settling anything on his own. Marcus tells me you handled the Caldwell matter with some distinction, Clifford said during the main course, cutting his beef with geometric precision. The Caldwell litigation took 14 months. We prevailed on every contested point. What was the exposure? Combined potential liability was just under $200 million. We settled the residual regulatory component at 11. Clifford nodded. Cut another piece. Marcus also tells me you were willing to reframe the subsidiary structure in a way that other attorneys found, what was the word he used, creative. The structure was entirely within the bounds of applicable law. Of course. Clifford's face didn't change. I'm not questioning that. I'm noting the disposition. He looked up from his plate. I need men around me who understand that the law is a framework, not a ceiling. Men who understand the difference between what the language prohibits and what it permits, and who have the intelligence and the flexibility to operate in that space. Are you that kind of attorney, Mr. Vale? The word flexibility sat in the air between them. Grayson understood exactly what was being asked, heard it with the precision his training had given him, and made a decision in the span of about 4 seconds that he would later identify as the actual point of no return. Not the divorce papers, not any of the preceding months, but this dinner table, this question, this answer. "Yes," he said. "I am." Clifford picked up his wine. "Vivian speaks very highly of you." It wasn't a compliment, it was a closing statement. Preston looked at Grayson for the first time all evening with something that might have been pity. Grayson drove home with 72 hours of adrenaline slowly draining out of his system and the specific hollow feeling of having passed a test he wasn't sure he should have taken. He turned the radio on and then turned it off again. The highway was mostly empty at that hour. He kept both hands on the wheel. His phone buzzed. An unknown number, a text. "Saw the filing today. Congratulations on making it official. Hope it was worth it." He stared at it at a red light, didn't recognize the number. Deleted the text. Drove the rest of the way home in silence. 3 weeks later, he walked away from Whitmore and Crane. Not fired. He was careful about that, careful the way he was careful about everything now, strategic at every step. He gave 60 days' notice, cited the desire to pursue private practice, shook hands with the partners, attended his own small, awkward farewell lunch, where people said generous things in careful language because nobody was sure quite what he was moving toward. His direct supervisor, a 20-year veteran named Harold Pitts, who had mentored Grayson through his early associate years, pulled him aside after the lunch and said quietly, "Grayson, you don't have to tell me anything, but I want you to know that the Ashcroft family has a long history with attorneys, and the pattern of that history is not what you'd want for your career." "I appreciate that, Harold." "I'm not sure you do." Harold was a small man with a deliberate quality to everything he did, and he was looking at Grayson now with something close to grief. "I've watched you for 11 years. You're one of the most naturally gifted litigators I've ever seen. You have something that can't be taught. And I've watched men with that same quality walk into rooms like the ones you're walking into and come out, changed, in ways that don't recover." Grayson put a hand on his shoulder. "I'll be fine, Harold." Harold looked at him for a long moment. "I know you believe that." He walked away first, which wasn't like him, and Grayson stood in the hallway outside the conference room and watched him go and felt, briefly, the full weight of what was receding behind him. The institution, the people, the particular identity he'd built in this building. And then he rolled his shoulders and turned and walked toward the elevator. The Ashcroft Capital Legal Office occupied the 19th floor of a building in Midtown that had been designed to communicate permanence. Grayson's new office had a view and a desk made from something heavy and dark and expensive. And on his first morning, Marcus Fielding appeared in the doorway at 8:15 sharp, poured himself a coffee from the credenza, and sat down without being invited. Marcus was 55 and had the quality of a man who had survived multiple administrations by being more useful than anyone else and less visible than everyone. He had fine, thinning hair and a habit of touching his tie when he was calculating something. He touched it now. "Welcome," he said, with a warmth that didn't quite reach his face. "Clifford is glad you're here. I'm glad you're here. I want us to work well together." "I intend to." "Good. Then I want to be direct with you about something." He set his coffee down. "You're not the first attorney Clifford has brought in laterally. There's a learning curve that's less about the law and more about, let's call it, organizational culture. Clifford has a preferred way of handling things. There are matters that go through me and matters that go directly through him, and you will learn quickly which are which. You do not freelance. You do not communicate outside established channels. You do not build relationships with individuals in this organization without my knowledge." Grayson kept his face neutral. "Is this a welcome speech or a threat?" Marcus smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that meant he'd heard the right answer. "It's orientation," he said. "There's a difference." He picked up his coffee again. "The Meridian development requires some legal architecture that we've been waiting on the right person to build. You're going to start there. I'll have the file on your desk by 10. The Meridian file was enormous, and the architecture it required was, as Clifford had suggested at dinner, creative in ways that occupied a gray space Grayson was trained to navigate. He spent the first 2 weeks working 16-hour days, barely surfacing, eating at his desk, learning the shape of the Ashcroft operation with the particular focus he brought to anything that required his full intelligence. There was a satisfaction to it, he couldn't deny that. The size of the thing, the complexity, the way the pieces fit together when you understood the underlying logic. He was good at this. He'd always been good at this. He thought about Elena 3 times in those 2 weeks. Each time, he put it away. The 4th week, he got a call from Daniel Osei. Daniel had been one of his closest friends since law school. They'd shared an apartment for 2 years, pulled each other through bar prep, been in each other's corners at every significant professional moment since. Daniel had gone into civil rights litigation, was doing the kind of work that made national news occasionally, the kind of work Grayson had genuinely admired even as he'd moved in a different direction. He was also the kind of friend who said things directly. "I need to ask you something," Daniel said when Grayson picked up. No greeting, no preamble. "The Caldwell settlement, the subsidiary restructure. Were you the one who designed the holding company arrangement in the Cayman structure?" Grayson's hand tightened on the phone. "That matter is covered by attorney-client privilege, Daniel. I'm not asking you as an attorney. I'm asking you as the person who helped me study for the ethics component of the bar exam." Silence on the line. The city outside Grayson's window moved its usual indifferent way. "What's this about?" Grayson asked. "I have a client, a family. They lost their home in the Caldwell foreclosure chain, a foreclosure that should have been stopped by a legal challenge that was, from what I can piece together, quietly buried during the period your firm was restructuring the debt obligations. I'm trying to understand what happened. Then file a discovery motion and pursue it through proper channels." "Grayson." Daniel's voice was steady, but tight underneath. "I've known you for 15 years. I watched you study ethics not because it was tested, but because you actually believed it. I'm asking you, did you know what you were doing to people like my client when you built that structure?" The question sat there. Grayson's jaw was doing the thing again, tight without his permission. "I built a legally defensible structure that achieved the client's legitimate objectives," he said. "Anything else is outside my knowledge." A long pause. "Okay," Daniel said quietly. "Okay, Grayson, I hear you." He hung up. Grayson set the phone on the desk and stared at the Meridian file for 30 seconds. Then he opened it and went back to work. He didn't hear from Daniel again. Vivian appeared at his office that Friday at 6 p.m. when most of the floor had emptied, wearing something that made the building feel underdressed. She dropped into the chair across from his desk with the casual ease of a person who understood that most spaces they entered automatically adjusted to them, and she looked at the files stacked across every surface. "You've been hard to reach," she said. "I've been working." "My father is pleased. That matters." She crossed one leg over the other. "Preston is less pleased." Grayson looked up. "Why?" "Because Preston has been managing the Meridian legal structure for 2 years, and now you're managing it, and Preston considers that geography his." She said it lightly, but her eyes were careful. "I'm telling you because you should know, not because it's something I can fix. Preston and I have a complicated relationship with the concept of sharing. I can handle Preston. Probably, just don't underestimate how long he holds things. He's patient in a way that's not entirely healthy." She stood up, moved to his side of the desk, looked at the file open in front of him. "Is this the offshore channeling structure for Phase 3? "Yes." She leaned over to look at it, closer than necessary, and he caught that cedar and something scent again. "This is elegant," she said. And she meant the legal architecture. He understood that, but the word still landed wrong. Elegant. He'd built a house of cards, and she was admiring the craftsmanship. "It works," he said flatly. She straightened up, looked at him with that reading the subtext expression she'd had since the first night. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "You don't look fine. You look like you're carrying something that doesn't belong on your desk." "I said I'm fine, Vivian." A beat. "Okay," she said, in a tone that meant she didn't believe him, but had categorized it as not her current problem. "Dinner Sunday. My father's having a small gathering, 4 couples, including the Holloway principals. You should be there." "I'll be there." She left. He stayed until 9 o'clock, then drove home to the apartment he'd moved into. Smaller than what he'd shared with Elena, cleaner, completely impersonal, like a hotel room he'd been inhabiting for several months. And he stood in the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and stood there looking at its contents for a full minute before closing it without taking anything out. He sat down on the couch, put his phone on the cushion beside him, looked at the wall. His phone lit up. A number he recognized, a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Carol who had been in their social circle during the marriage, someone he hadn't spoken to since before the divorce. The message was brief. Just saw Elena at the Morrison Legal Gala. She's doing really well. Thought you should know. He read it twice. He almost typed back. His thumb hovered. Then he set the phone face down on the cushion and pressed his palms against his knees and sat very still in his empty apartment and did the thing he was good at. He closed the box. The Sunday dinner produced the Holloway introduction he needed, and within 6 weeks the acquisition legal work was formally transferred to his oversight. The scope of what he was now managing had grown faster than he'd anticipated. Not uncomfortably fast, but fast enough that he was aware of how deep into the Ashcroft structure he'd moved. He had access now to financial frameworks and corporate arrangements that he understood were not the kind of thing that released a person easily, not because of contracts, but because of information. He knew things. The kind of things that made you valuable and kept you valuable, and also made certain exits permanently unavailable. He thought about that sometimes at night. Then he closed that box too. Preston arrived at his office on a Tuesday in late November without a meeting on the calendar. He closed the door behind him, quietly, which was worse than slamming it, and sat in the chair across from the desk and folded his hands in his lap. The Holloway structure, Preston said. What about it? You filed the Phase 2 regulatory documentation last week. I did. Marcus approved the timeline. Marcus approved your timeline. Preston's voice was flat and informational. Not the approach I'd outlined previously. The approach you outlined previously had a 12-month exposure window that Phase 2 can't sustain. I restructured to compress the window to 90 days. It's cleaner. It may be cleaner. Preston unfolded his hands, refolded them. But I'd spent 14 months building relationships with the regulatory contacts necessary to manage the longer timeline. Those relationships are still intact. Those relationships, Preston said slowly, were predicated on a specific assurance structure that your 90-day compression makes obsolete, which means I've spent 14 months cultivating contacts I'm now unable to use in the way I'd intended. He paused. I'm not angry, Grayson. I want you to understand that. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand precisely what you've done and precisely what it means in terms of our working relationship going forward. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, looked at Grayson with those surveillance eyes. My father values results, Preston said. He always has. And results are what you're delivering, and I respect that. I simply want you to know that I notice things, I notice patterns, and I'm patient. He moved to the door. Welcome to Ashcroft Capital, Grayson. I hope it's everything you expected. He left the door open behind him. Grayson sat at his desk and felt the architecture of the situation settle around him with a new weight. He'd known Preston was a problem. He'd underestimated the specific nature of the problem. Preston wasn't reacting. Preston was recording. Building something on a timeline Grayson couldn't see. He picked up his phone, almost called Daniel Osei. Put the phone down. There was no one left in his life who would receive that call with anything other than confirmation that he'd made the bed he was lying in. And he had. He knew that. The self-awareness didn't comfort him. It was just accurate. He pulled the Meridian Phase 3 file toward him and opened it and went back to work because that was the one thing that had never failed him, the one place where his intelligence operated cleanly without the interference of everything else. The call came on a Thursday morning in March, not to his cell, to his office line, which almost no one had, which meant it had come through the main Ashcroft switchboard. He picked it up. Grayson Vale. A voice he didn't recognize. Professional, measured. My name is Special Agent Catherine Doyle. I'm with the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. I'd like to arrange a time to speak with you about certain transactions associated with the Meridian Development Project and the Holloway acquisition. This is an initial courtesy contact. You're not required to respond, but I'd encourage you to consult with personal counsel before we speak formally. Do you understand? He understood. He set the phone down very carefully in its cradle. He sat completely still for 37 seconds, which he counted without meaning to, and during those 37 seconds, the full shape of the situation assembled itself in his mind with a horrible, clarifying completeness. The offshore structures, the Phase 2 compression, the regulatory contacts, Preston's patience, Marcus's channels, Clifford's careful dinner table language about flexibility and frameworks and what the law permits. And Grayson Vale, who had built his career on the ability to read a situation from every available angle simultaneously, read this one and understood with absolute certainty that he was not standing at the edge of something. He was already inside it. He picked up his personal cell phone, dialed the one number that might still answer honestly. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail, and Harold Pitt's recorded voice said to leave a message at the tone. "Harold," Grayson said. His own voice came out steady, which surprised him. "It's Grayson. I think I need to talk to you. I think—" He stopped. The box he'd been closing for 8 months cracked open all at once, everything inside it spilling across the floor of his chest. "I think I made a mistake," he said. "I think I made several, and I'm not sure what to do with that." He ended the call. Put the phone face down on the desk. Outside his window, the city continued its indifferent work. 30 stories below, people moved along sidewalks with their coffee and their phones and their ordinary complicated lives, and none of them knew that in an office above them, a man who had spent the better part of a year dismantling everything he'd built in exchange for everything he thought he wanted, had just received a phone call that had made the exchange feel, for the first time, entirely and irreversibly real. The intercom on his desk line buzzed. His assistant's voice. "Mr. Vale, Marcus Fielding is here. He says it's urgent." Grayson looked at the intercom, looked at his phone, looked at the Meridian file still open on his desk, all that elegant, compressed, creative legal architecture spread out across the pages like a blueprint for a building that had just been condemned. "Send him in," he said. The door opened and Marcus walked in, and his face had a quality Grayson had never seen on it before. Not calm, not calculating, not warmly professional. Something older and harder than any of those things. The expression of a man who has run a particular play many times and knows exactly how the next several moves unfold. He closed the door, sat down, and before he said a single word, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed a thumb drive on Grayson's desk. The thumb drive sat between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Grayson didn't touch it. He looked at it, then looked at Marcus. And the thing about Marcus's face in that moment was that it had stopped performing entirely. The warmth was gone. The professional courtesy, the orientation speech cadence, the careful management of every micro-expression. All of it had been set aside, the way you set aside a tool you no longer need because you've moved to a different phase of the work. "Pick it up," Marcus said. "Tell me what's on it first." "Pick it up, Grayson." He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers. Standard drive, nothing written on it, the plastic casing slightly worn at one corner like it had been handled many times. "That drive contains documentation," Marcus said. "Specifically, it contains a series of internal memoranda, transaction authorizations, and regulatory correspondence, all bearing your signature or your digital authorization code, related to the Meridian Phase 2 restructure and 3 components of the Holloway acquisition legal framework." Grayson set the drive on the desk in front of him. "I authorized those documents." "You did." "Under the structure Marcus approved. Under the structure Clifford's team outlined. Under the structure you designed," Marcus said, and the correction was so quiet and so precise that it took Grayson a full second to absorb its full implication. "The documentation is very clear on that point. The originating legal architecture for both Meridian Phase 2 and the Holloway channeling structure is attributed with considerable specificity to you." The room had a particular quality now, the way rooms get when something irreversible is being said out loud. Grayson could hear the ventilation system, could hear his own breathing, slower than it should have been. "That's not accurate," he said. "The documents say otherwise." "The documents have been altered." Marcus tilted his head, a minimal movement that communicated neither confirmation nor denial. "That's a significant allegation. You'd need evidence to support it." "I need to see those documents." "They're on the drive." Grayson looked at the drive. "Marcus, look at me." He waited until Marcus met his eyes. "I need you to tell me right now, directly, what is happening in this room." Marcus was quiet for 3 seconds. 5. Then he said, "What's happening is that the FBI has opened a formal inquiry into certain financial structures associated with Ashcroft Capital. That inquiry has been anticipated by certain members of this organization for some time. Preparations have been made." He paused. "You are, as of this conversation, the named architect of the structures under examination." Grayson stood up. The chair rolled back and hit the credenza, and he didn't notice. He was standing at full height with his hands flat on the desk, and his vision had gone very sharp and very narrow the way it did in the worst moments of cross-examination, when the witness says something that reframes everything and you have approximately 3 seconds to decide how to respond. "I am the named architect," he repeated. "In the documentation, yes." "And Clifford." "Clifford Ashcroft has no documented involvement in the structures in question. Neither does Preston. Neither does anyone currently employed by Ashcroft Capital in a senior capacity." Marcus touched his tie. "This was a careful process, Grayson. It took some time to get right." "You set me up." He said it without inflection, just the fact of it, placed on the desk between them like the drive. Marcus didn't answer, which was its own answer. "From the beginning," Grayson said, "the Meridian file, putting the originating work in my name. The Holloway authorization codes routed through my credentials. This was the plan from the moment Clifford invited me to dinner." "You're a very talented attorney," Marcus said, and the compliment landed like a slap. Clifford recognized that immediately. The structures needed a mind capable of building them credibly. They also needed a name attached to them that was external. Someone with an established professional reputation who could be presented as an independent contractor operating beyond the normal scope of Ashcroft's internal legal team. He straightened his jacket. "You fit every criterion." Grayson's hands curled against the desk. "And Vivienne." Something crossed Marcus's face, just briefly. "Vivienne introduced you to the family. She was instrumental in the recruitment. Was she aware of what you were doing with my credentials?" A pause that lasted 1 beat too long. "Vivienne's role is separate from this conversation." "Was she aware, Marcus?" "You should ask her that yourself." He wanted to put his fist through the window. He wanted to overturn the desk. He did neither of those things because he was Grayson Vale, and he had trained himself for 11 years to keep his hands still when everything in him was moving, and he used that training now with everything he had. "Get out of my office," he said. "This is Ashcroft Capital property. I'd encourage you to get out of my office right now." Marcus stood, smoothed the front of his jacket with both palms. "The drive is yours to do with as you choose. I'd suggest you review it carefully and consult with an attorney you trust. A personal attorney, not someone connected to this organization." He moved to the door. "And Grayson, the FBI inquiry is at an early stage. What happens next depends significantly on the decisions you make in the next 72 hours. I'd think carefully." He left. The door didn't quite close all the way, and Grayson stood there for a moment looking at the gap, then walked over and closed it himself, and stood with his hand on the door handle, his back to the room, his forehead almost touching the wood. He stood like that for a long time. Then he turned, picked up the drive, and went to work. He plugged it into his laptop and opened the files one by one and read every document with the systematic, airless focus of a man doing triage on a battlefield, because that was what this was. He read for 2 hours. His coffee went cold at his elbow. His phone lit up twice. Vivienne, both times, and he ignored it both times without looking away from the screen. The documentation was, as Marcus had said, careful. Grayson's name appeared not as a rubber stamp, but as the originating intelligence. Memos drafted in language that matched his style, strategic rationale written in the first-person voice he used in client communications, authorization signatures that matched his official DocuSign credentials with timestamp authentication that placed every critical decision in his hands. Someone had studied him, had spent months gathering samples of his written voice, his decision-making patterns, his authorization habits, and had constructed a paper identity that was, in every technical sense, indistinguishable from the real thing. The Meridian Phase 2 compression, the Holloway offshore channeling, a third structure he hadn't fully understood the scope of until now. A series of fund movements through a Luxembourg intermediary that had touched and contaminated a pension fund connected to a municipal employees' union. Real people, real retirement savings, exposed to instruments they'd never consented to. He closed his laptop. He sat in the silence of the office and let the full weight of it land without deflecting any of it, because there was no box left to close. The boxes were all open. Everything he'd been putting away for 8 months was spread across the floor at once, and the combined mass of it was almost physical. He felt it in his shoulders, his chest, behind his eyes. His phone lit up again. This time, the number was different. A number he hadn't seen in almost a year. He stared at it for 2 rings, then picked up. Grayson. Elena's voice. Calm, but not at rest. He knew the difference. I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else. Your name is being circulated in connection with a federal investigation. I have a contact in the DA's office. He told me this morning. He closed his eyes. Elena, I'm not calling for any other reason than that. You have a son. He's 4 months old. Whatever you've done, whatever happens next, I need you to understand that decisions you make right now will reach him eventually. I need you to understand that clearly. A pause. That's all I have to say. Elena, that's all I have to say, Grayson. She hung up. He held the phone against his ear for a moment after the line went dead, listening to nothing, and then lowered it slowly to his lap. A son, 4 months old. He'd known that. In the distant, boxed-away way he'd known everything. The pregnancy, the birth, a notification from his divorce attorney about the updated child support provisions. He'd processed it as paperwork, as logistics, as he had processed everything. He hadn't let himself know it as a fact about a person, about a child who existed in the world, who was 4 months old, who had a mother who had called her ex-husband to warn him about a federal investigation, not because she owed him anything, but because their son would eventually look at his father's choices and form conclusions about what a man's life means. Grayson put the phone in his pocket, stood up, took his jacket off the back of his chair, and left the office. He drove to Vivienne's building, didn't call ahead, took the elevator to the 32nd floor and knocked on her door and waited with his hands in his pockets and his jaw doing the thing. She opened the door after a long moment, and her face, when she saw him, did something complicated that he cataloged carefully. Surprise, but not the clean kind, the kind that has something underneath it. You called twice, he said. I did. You knew I wasn't going to answer. She stepped back from the door. He walked in. The penthouse felt different now. The cedar smell, the expensive light, the floor-to-ceiling view, the same stage set, differently lit. Marcus came to see me, he said. She moved to the kitchen, put the kettle on. Her back was to him. I expected he would. Were you aware, Vivienne? I need you to answer me directly. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her face had settled into something he'd never seen on it. Not warmth, not assessment, not the reading the subtext expression. Something quieter than all of those. Something that might, in other circumstances, have looked like regret. I introduced you to my father, she said. That's not an answer. I introduced you to my father because he needed a specific kind of attorney, and you were the best version of what he needed. That's true. That was my role. She held his gaze. What Marcus and Preston did with the documentation after you were inside the structure, I was not fully informed of the specifics until recently. Recently. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. He counted backward. 3 weeks ago, he'd been at a dinner at her father's club discussing the Phase 3 expansion timeline. He'd been optimistic about Phase 3. He told her over drinks afterward that he felt like he was finally operating at the level he'd always known he was capable of. She'd smiled. She'd said, I told you this was the right move. 3 weeks ago, you found out they were setting me up to take the fall for a federal fraud case, and you had dinner with me and told me I was doing well. I was trying to determine the best course of action. The best course of Vivienne. His voice cracked, just at the edge, and he pulled it back. There is a pension fund. There are real people, retired municipal workers, whose money was moved through structures that have my name on them. There is an FBI agent who called my office this morning, and you spent 3 weeks determining your best course of action. She looked at him steadily. My family built something over 50 years. Regardless of how it was built, it employs thousands of people. The legal exposure, if it falls on my father, don't. He held up one hand. Don't complete that sentence. She stopped. He looked around the penthouse, at the life he'd been walking toward, at what it actually was, stripped of the cedar smell and the good wine and the private jets and the clean, intoxicating promise of being, finally, the most important person in the most important room. A vehicle. That was what he'd been. A purpose-built vehicle with his name on the registration, pointed at a wall. I need to go, he said. Grayson, if you contact the FBI without... I'm not discussing strategy with you. If you act without understanding what my father will do. Vivienne. He stopped at the door, turned back. She was standing in the kitchen with the kettle beginning to whistle behind her, and she looked, for the first time since he'd known her, like someone who was genuinely uncertain of the outcome. It didn't move him. He understood clearly and without drama that it should have moved him and didn't, which was its own information about what she had been to him and what he had been to her. Tell your father I said nothing is handled. He left. The drive back to his apartment was 22 minutes, and he used all 22 of them thinking, which was what he did when everything else failed. He thought about the drive, the documentation, the authentication timestamps. He thought about what could be challenged and what couldn't, and what a prosecutor would do with what they had and what the defensive options were at this stage. Then he stopped thinking like an Ashcroft attorney and started thinking like himself. There were things he knew, things he'd seen that weren't on that drive. Internal communications he'd been copied on that Marcus wouldn't have thought to scrub because they predated the decision to make Grayson the fall position. There were 3 emails from Preston to a Luxembourg contact that had come through a shared server thread. Administrative accident, the kind of small sloppiness that large organizations generate because they're too confident in the architecture to double-check the plumbing. Grayson had read them at the time, filed them away as organizational context, moved on. He hadn't moved on. Not really. Some part of his lawyer brain had kept them in a pocket he hadn't consciously acknowledged. He got back to his apartment, opened his personal laptop, not the Ashcroft-issued machine, his own, the one he'd brought from Whitmore and Crane, and maintained separately out of a habit he couldn't have fully explained at the time but was now deeply grateful for. He opened the email archive, found the thread, copied the 3 messages to a secure folder. Then he called the only attorney he trusted. It wasn't Harold. Harold would have answered the right way and said the right things and genuinely tried to help, but Harold was still in the orbit of the legal establishment that Clifford Ashcroft had been cultivating for 40 years, and that orbit was not safe right now. Instead, he called a woman named Sandra Chu, who had been 2 years ahead of him at Harrington, had spent 12 years as a federal public defender before going into private practice, and who had a reputation for being the person you called when the situation was past the point where reputation management was still a viable strategy. She answered on the second ring. Grayson Vale, haven't heard from you since your wedding. I need to meet with you tomorrow morning, early. A pause. How bad? Federal inquiry bad, bad. Criminal or civil exposure? Criminal. Potentially significant. Another pause, this one longer. He could hear her thinking. 7 a.m., my office. Bring everything you have and don't talk to anyone between now and then. Anyone, Grayson. Not friends, not colleagues, not family. Understood. And don't go back to the Ashcroft building. He looked at his apartment wall. I won't. I mean it. Not to clean out your desk, not to return a laptop, not to say goodbye to anyone. Don't go back in that building. Sandra, I know you know what I'm telling you. I'm telling you anyway, because smart people do stupid things when they're in shock. And you're in shock right now, whether you know it or not. He was quiet. Yeah, I know. 7 a.m., don't be late. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and the laptop open in front of him, and the secure folder with 3 emails in it. And outside his window, the city was doing its nighttime version of itself, the lights multiplying as the dark settled in, and Grayson Vale sat in his anonymous apartment surrounded by the wreckage of every careful, calculated decision he'd made in the last 18 months, and felt, underneath the fear and the shock and the activated legal machinery of his mind, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Clarity. Not comfort. Not relief. Not anything that felt good. Just the particular sharpness that comes when all the performance falls away and what remains is simply what's true. What was true? He had walked into this willingly. Every warning had been visible, and he had chosen not to see it. Harold, Daniel, the dinner table question about flexibility, the documentation in his name, the too perfect access, the too rapid advancement, the too clear path. All of it had been readable, and he had read it and chosen the version of the reading that confirmed what he wanted to believe. What was also true, the 3 emails in the secure folder existed, and they were real, and they pointed somewhere other than him. What was also true, a 4-month-old child he had never met had a mother who had called him on the morning his life came apart. Not to say I told you so, though she had told him so, in every quiet way available, but to say, There is a person who will eventually look at what you did and decide what it means. He closed the laptop, set it on the table, stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his arms at his sides, not leaning, not performing anything for anyone. Just a man standing at a window in a city that didn't care about him, trying to figure out what kind of man he was willing to be in the time that remained. His phone buzzed once, a text from an unsaved number he recognized as one of Preston's assistants. No words, just a link to a news article. He clicked it. The headline: Federal Probe into Ashcroft Capital Subsidiary Structures Names Independent Legal Architect. His name was in the second paragraph. The third paragraph described the pension fund exposure. The fourth quoted an anonymous source inside the organization describing a rogue attorney who had operated outside the standard oversight structure. The article had been published 6 minutes ago. His phone began ringing. He turned it face down, picked up his laptop and his keys and his jacket, and walked out of the apartment without any plan except the 7 a.m. meeting and the 3 emails in the secure folder and the specific, groundless, inexplicable decision that he was not going to go down for this alone. He took the stairs instead of the elevator, 12 flights, because he needed to move, and when he pushed through the door into the cold night air, he stood on the sidewalk and breathed, just breathed, the way you breathe when you've been underground for a long time, and the air hits you all at once, and you can't quite believe it's real. His phone lit up through his jacket pocket. He didn't take it out. He started walking. He walked for 40 minutes without direction, through streets that shifted from commercial to residential to the older, quieter blocks near the river, where the buildings got lower and the light got softer, and at some point he found himself standing outside a building he hadn't planned to be near. A converted storefront with a hand-painted sign above the door, lit from inside against the dark. Rowan Community Legal Clinic. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. The lights were on. It was past 9 p.m. Through the front window he could see a woman at a desk, head bent over paperwork, a lamp throwing its circle of yellow over her work. And Grayson Vale, who had made partner at 34 and built legal frameworks for a billionaire family, and had his name in a federal investigation article that was currently spreading across every financial news platform in the country, stood on that sidewalk in the dark and looked at what Elena Rowan had built in the time he'd been building something else, and felt the full weight of the comparison without looking away from it. She didn't look up. She didn't know he was there. She was just working the way she had always worked, without performance, without an audience. Just the problem in front of her and the intelligence she brought to it, and the people depending on the outcome. He stood there long enough that the cold started working through his jacket. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. And the article was still out there, and the FBI was still looking, and Preston Ashcroft was somewhere in the city building whatever he'd been patiently building for months. And Grayson had 3 emails and 1 attorney, and approximately 72 hours before the situation calcified into something he couldn't move. He took out his phone, opened a new message, typed a name he hadn't typed in over a year. Daniel, I owe you a real answer to the question you asked me on the phone. I'm ready to give it. But first I need your help with something, and I understand completely if the answer is no. His thumb hovered. He hit send. Daniel didn't reply that night. Grayson walked back to his apartment, sat in the dark with his jacket still on, and watched the phone. Nothing. He didn't blame Daniel. He'd sent the message at nearly 10 p.m. after 14 months of silence, asking for help he hadn't earned the right to ask for. He set the phone on the table, lay back on the couch fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling until sometime around 2 in the morning when exhaustion finally overruled everything else. He woke at 5:15, showered, put on the same suit, made coffee that tasted like nothing, and drank it standing at the counter. Checked his phone. Daniel had replied at 4:47 a.m. 4 words, I'll be there. 7. Sandra Chu's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan that had the specific quality of places where serious work gets done without any interest in looking impressive. No artwork on the walls, no impressive reception area. A paralegal who was already at her desk at 6:55 when Grayson arrived and showed him to a conference room with a long table, a whiteboard, and 2 chairs. 5 minutes later, Sandra walked in carrying a legal pad and a coffee that looked like her 3rd of the morning. She was 51, Korean-American, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had the earned quality of someone who had spent 20-plus years watching people in their worst moments and maintained, through all of it, a very clear idea of the difference between what she could control and what she couldn't. She sat down across from him, opened her legal pad, and said without preamble, "Walk me through it. Everything. Don't edit." He walked her through it. 45 minutes. She didn't interrupt. She wrote constantly, filling pages in a compressed, abbreviated script, occasionally circling something or drawing a line connecting two items. When he finished, she sat for a moment reviewing her notes, then looked up. "The 3 emails," she said. "Copies are in this." He slid a USB drive across the table. "You pulled them from a personal archive?" "Yes. Copied to my personal machine before any of the Ashcroft access was established. They were in a shared thread that predated my employment. So your access to them is clean." "My access to them is completely clean." She picked up the drive, turned it over. "What do they show?" Preston Ashcroft corresponding directly with a Luxembourg intermediary about the fund movement structure. Specific instructions for the routing that matches exactly the structure that now has my name on the originating documentation. The timing predates my involvement by 4 months. Sandra set the drive down. "That's not exoneration. That's foundation." "I know. The documentation on their drive shows you building it. Your emails show Preston directing the concept. A prosecutor will argue you implemented someone else's framework and made it yours." "I know that too. So what else do you have?" He took a breath. "Nothing else yet, but I know where to look. There's a server administrator at Ashcroft Capital, a man named Thomas Greer, who managed the document management system during the period when my credentials were used. He's not senior, he's not part of the family structure, he's a technical employee. If the credential manipulation was done at the system level, he either did it, supervised it, or knows who did. Can you reach him?" "Not directly, not anymore. But someone who knew him before my involvement might be able to." Sandra looked at him steadily. The knock on the door came at 7:15. Daniel Osei walked in, and the first thing he did was look at Grayson for a long, undeflecting moment that carried everything the 14 months of silence had accumulated: disappointment, something older than anger, and underneath both of those, the stubborn residue of genuine friendship that hadn't entirely died even when it should have. He sat down without shaking hands, put his own legal pad on the table. "Your client from the Caldwell foreclosure chain," Grayson said. "The family that lost their home." "What about them?" "I want to understand exactly what happened to them, every step of the process." Daniel looked at Sandra, then back at Grayson. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to build a case that exposes what Ashcroft Capital actually did to people, I need to understand what it looks like from the people it happened to. Not the documentation, the actual human result." Something shifted in Daniel's face. Not warmth, not yet, but a door opening a degree. "The Pattersons," he said. "Marcus and Dolores Patterson. 22 years in that house. Raised 3 kids there. The foreclosure was initiated through a debt instrument that had been repackaged and resold through a chain of subsidiaries that made the original note practically unidentifiable. When I tried to challenge the standing of the foreclosing entity, the court filings got delayed through a procedural argument that I later determined had been coordinated by outside counsel connected to Whitmore and Crane." Grayson absorbed that without looking away. "Connected to me?" "Connected to the firm. I don't know specifically who." Daniel paused. "But the delay cost us the injunction window, and the Pattersons were out of their house in 11 days. The room was quiet. "I'm going to need their story," Grayson said. "With their permission. I'm going to need it on the record." "For what purpose?" "When this goes to a courtroom," and it is going to a courtroom, Daniel, whether I walk in voluntarily or get walked in, "I want the human damage documented alongside the financial structure. I want a judge to understand that the numbers on those documents correspond to a family with 3 kids who lost their home in 11 days. Daniel looked at him for a long time. "You're going to go to the FBI." "I'm going to go to the FBI with Sandra, with the emails, and with a cooperation framework that gives them Clifford and Preston Ashcroft in exchange for—" "Grayson," Sandra's voice, quiet but firm, "we talk strategy in this room before you announce it. He needs to know what he's walking into if he's going to help me." Daniel sat back, rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man running a calculation that involves more than just numbers. "If I help you build this case and it falls apart, it won't fall apart. You don't know that." "No, But I know the 3 emails are real, and I know the credential manipulation happened. And I know that Preston Ashcroft has been building toward this for over a year, with a patience that has left tracks. Because patient people always leave tracks. Because they're confident enough to move slowly, and confidence makes you sloppy at the margins. He leaned forward. I need you, Daniel. I know I don't have the right to ask. I'm asking anyway. Daniel looked at his legal pad. Looked at Grayson. The Pattersons would have to consent to being involved. I understand. I'd have to talk to them today. I know. And Grayson. He waited until Grayson met his eyes. If at any point this stops being about exposing what they did and starts being about you escaping consequences for what you did, I walk, clean, no explanation necessary. Fair. I mean it. I know you mean it. That's why I called you. The 3 of them worked for 4 hours straight. Sandra mapped the legal exposure and the cooperation framework in granular detail, building the structure of what they'd offer the FBI and what they'd require in return, the sequential disclosure strategy, the documentation chain, the witness sequencing. Daniel cross-referenced the Caldwell foreclosure record against the Ashcroft subsidiary chain, finding 3 additional connection points that Sandra immediately incorporated into the framework. Grayson sat between them and functioned as the technical translator, the person who understood both the human damage and the financial architecture well enough to build the bridge between them. At 11:15, Sandra called her contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Not Agent Doyle, a senior relationship she'd cultivated over 12 years of federal defense work, a deputy section chief named Warren Briggs, who answered on the first ring and listened to 4 sentences before saying, "Get your client in here this afternoon." They were in the federal building by 2 p.m. The meeting with Briggs and Agent Doyle lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes, and Grayson talked for most of it, with Sandra interrupting exactly 4 times to reframe questions that were moving toward territory she'd designated as outside the scope of the cooperation offer. He laid out the structure, the emails, the credential manipulation theory, and the name Thomas Greer, the Luxembourg correspondence, the pension fund routing and its connection to the Holloway acquisition framework that bore Preston's conceptual fingerprints and Grayson's forged authorization signature. Doyle was in her late 30s, precise in the way of someone who had learned that precision was the best available weapon, and she asked her questions in a sequence that Grayson recognized as designed to test the internal consistency of his account, circling back to earlier statements from different angles, looking for the place where the story shifted. It didn't shift. He was telling the truth, which made consistency effortless in a way that lying never quite managed. At 4:50 p.m., Briggs stepped out to make a call. Came back 7 minutes later, sat down. We'll want the original drive. We'll want access to the personal archive. We'll want a signed proffer agreement by end of business Friday. He looked at Sandra. And we'll need Mr. Vale available for testimony at whatever proceedings result from this inquiry. What's the exposure structure under the cooperation agreement? Sandra asked. Reduced charges on the originating fraud count. Suspended sentence contingent on testimony and complete disclosure. He does not walk clean, this goes on his record, but he walks. Grayson said, I want the pension fund holders made whole. Doyle looked at him. Whatever restitution structure comes out of the Ashcroft proceedings, I want documentation that the municipal pension fund is prioritized in the recovery. Briggs said, that's not something we can guarantee in a proffer agreement. I'm not asking for a guarantee. I'm asking for a documented commitment that it's a priority in whatever asset recovery framework the prosecution pursues. It costs you nothing to commit to that, and it means something to real people. A pause. Briggs and Doyle exchanged a look. We can note it in the cooperation documentation, Doyle said. Note it clearly. Clearly, she agreed. They left the federal building at 5:40 into a late afternoon that had turned sharp and cold, the 3 of them standing on the sidewalk with the city moving around them, and Daniel put his hands in his pockets and looked at Grayson and said, I'll call the Pattersons tonight. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, this is a long road. I know. Daniel nodded once, the compact nod of a man refiling something under a new category, and walked toward the subway without looking back. Sandra said, Proffer agreement by Friday. Don't talk to anyone from Ashcroft between now and then. If Vivian calls, she won't. If she does, she won't. She's managed her position already. He looked down the street. She's very good at that. Sandra studied him for a moment. You're going to be okay. Not quickly, but you're going to be okay. I know, he said, in a voice that didn't entirely believe it yet but was working on it. She left. He stood on the sidewalk alone. His phone had 17 missed calls, 12 from numbers he didn't recognize. Press, he assumed, the article still circulating. 3 from the main Ashcroft Capital switchboard. 1 from Marcus. 1 from a number that took him a moment to place and then recognized as belonging to one of the senior partners at Whitmore and Crane, not Harold, one of the others, which meant the firm was already managing its own exposure to any association with his name, and 1 from Preston Ashcroft's personal cell. He stood looking at that last one for a moment. Preston had never called him directly, not once in 14 months. The fact of the call, more than any of the others, made the skin on the back of his neck tighten. He didn't call back. He went home, changed out of the suit, ate something he couldn't afterward identify, and sat at his table with a legal pad and spent 3 hours writing everything he knew, in longhand. Every conversation, every meeting, every document he'd seen, every decision and the context around it. The kind of comprehensive contemporaneous record that Sandra would tell him was unnecessary, but that he needed to do for his own reasons. To see the whole shape of it written out in his own hand. To hold himself accountable for every piece of it without any room for the kind of selective editing his mind was trained to perform. He finished at midnight, sat back. Read it from the beginning. It was not a flattering document. He'd known that it wouldn't be. But there was something in the reading of it, all of it together, that completed a process the last 24 hours had begun. The dismantling of a version of himself he'd been constructing for years. The one who had outgrown his origins and transcended the 2-bedroom Baltimore apartment, and arrived finally at the level where the real decisions were made by the real people. That version was done. The document made it very clear exactly when and how and why it had ended, and who had made the choices that ended it. He set the pen down. At 12:40, his phone buzzed with a text from Preston. Not the personal cell this time, a number he'd never seen. Meet me. Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. The coffee place on Vander and 51st. Come alone. There are things you don't know yet that you need to know before Friday. This is not a threat. This is the only offer I'm going to make. Grayson read it 3 times. He called Sandra. She picked up on the 3rd ring, alert in the specific way of attorneys who have learned to sleep lightly during active cases. He read her the text verbatim. Silence. Then, absolutely not. I know. Grayson, I know what you're going to say. Then say it back to me. It's a setup. It's a last-ditch attempt to compromise the cooperation agreement, introduce ambiguity into my witness position, or extract information about what I've already disclosed to the FBI. Or all 3. Or all 3. So you're not going. He looked at the text again. There are things you don't know yet. I'm not going, he said. A pause. Why don't I believe you? Because you're a good attorney. Grayson. I'm not going, Sandra. I'm going to get some sleep, and I'll see you Thursday to prep the proffer. She made a sound that meant she wasn't satisfied but was choosing to accept his word. They hung up. He put the phone on the table and looked at Preston's text one more time, then turned his phone face down. He went to bed. Lay in the dark. Thought about what Preston might actually know that he didn't. Thought about the one component of the Ashcroft structure he'd never fully understood. A series of communications between Clifford and a regulatory official whose name appeared twice in documents Grayson had seen, and then never again, scrubbed from later versions with a tidiness that he'd noted and filed, and never pursued because pursuing it hadn't seemed necessary at the time. It seemed necessary now. He got up, went back to his laptop, opened the personal archive and searched a name, Alderman Raymond Voss. 2 appearances in communications chains, both in the early Meridian Phase 1 documentation, both preceding any involvement by Grayson. A city official. Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. A name that appeared twice and then disappeared, which was the pattern of something that had been handled, whatever handled meant in the Ashcroft vocabulary. He sat with it. At 6:15 a.m. he was dressed, coffee in hand, standing at his window. At 6:45 he picked up his keys. Sandra would have been right that he shouldn't go. She was right. He knew she was right. He also knew that Preston Ashcroft had spent 14 months being the most patient person in every room, and that patient people did not send 12:40 a.m. texts unless whatever they were holding was too important to wait and too sensitive to put in writing through normal channels, and that there are things you don't know yet could mean nothing or could mean the Alderman Voss thread that nobody had ever fully closed. He drove to the coffee place on Vander and 51st. It was a small place, 3 tables, a counter, the kind of spot that had survived the neighborhood's gentrification by being completely uninterested in it. Grayson arrived at 6:58. Preston was already there, at the back table, no coffee in front of him, both hands folded on the table surface in that particular way of his. He looked up when Grayson walked in and said nothing, just watched him cross the room and sit down. They looked at each other across the table. "You went to the FBI," Preston said. Not a question. "You didn't actually need to meet me to know that." "No." Preston unfolded his hands, refolded them. "I needed to meet you because my father is going to move against you before the proffer agreement is signed, and I needed to tell you that in person, because this is the kind of thing that changes depending on how it's delivered." Grayson held very still. "What does move against mean?" "There is a man named Curtis Avery. He's employed by a security firm that my father has used for various purposes over the years. He was retained 48 hours ago for a specific task related to your cooperation with federal authorities." The room was small and warm and smelled like coffee, and the morning was ordinary outside the windows. People walking past, a delivery truck idling, a woman with a stroller. And Grayson sat in the middle of all that ordinary and felt his heartbeat change register. Slower, in the way that happens when the body is deciding what category of threat it's dealing with. "Are you telling me that your father hired someone to—" "I'm telling you that Curtis Avery was retained 48 hours ago, and that his professional history includes work that goes significantly beyond standard security consulting." Preston's voice was flat and completely steady. "I'm also telling you that I was not informed of this in advance. I found out last night. That's why I texted you." "Why are you telling me?" "Because I'm patient, not homicidal." Something crossed Preston's face, the first fully human expression Grayson had seen on him. Not quite guilt, something adjacent to it. "My father has run this organization for 50 years through a combination of intelligence and a specific willingness to do things that I have participated in and profited from and told myself were the cost of operating at this level. I have been telling myself that for a long time." He looked at his hands. "There is a line. I'm telling you where it is." Grayson leaned forward. "Raymond Voss." Preston looked up sharply. "He appears in the Phase 1 documentation twice and then disappears. Tell me what happened with Voss." A long pause. Preston's jaw worked. Voss facilitated the zoning variants that made Meridian possible. He was compensated through a structure that is considerably more legally exposed than anything currently in the FBI's scope of inquiry. "Is he still—" "He's alive," Preston said. "He retired from the committee 2 years ago. He lives in Scottsdale." He paused. "He has documentation of the compensation arrangement. He kept it as insurance. My father has been aware of this for some time and has chosen not to act on it because acting on it would create more exposure than the current stalemate." Voss would testify. Voss would testify in exchange for immunity. Preston straightened. "I'm giving you this because it means that what the FBI has with your cooperation is not the full case. It's a third of the case. Voss gives them the political corruption layer. That's a different category of federal exposure for my father. That's the thing that doesn't have a managed exit." Grayson stared at him. "Why, Preston? I told you, there's a line. You've been building against me for 14 months. I've been protecting the organization. That's different from what he's doing now." His voice stayed flat, but something underneath it was under significant pressure. "I have children. I have 2 daughters. I have spent the last 48 hours thinking about what they'll eventually know about how their family built what it built. And there is a specific answer to that question that I'm not willing to give them." The silence between them had a different quality now. "Curtis Avery," Grayson said. "How immediate is this?" "I don't have a timeline. I have a name and a 48-hour window, and the knowledge that my father does not retain people like Avery for long-term engagements." Preston stood up. "Call your attorney. Do it now, not after breakfast. Tell her what I told you and tell her you have a second cooperation witness with direct knowledge of the Voss arrangement, and tell her that witness is available to speak with federal authorities before end of business today." He moved to leave. Grayson said, "Preston." He stopped. "You know what this means for you." Preston turned back. His face had the quality of a man who has fully absorbed a cost and is no longer negotiating with it. "Yes," he said. "I know what it means." He walked out. The door closed behind him. The ordinary morning continued past the windows. Grayson had his phone out before Preston reached the sidewalk. Sandra picked up before the second ring. "Tell me you didn't go," she said. "I need you to call Briggs right now," he said. "We have a second witness, and Sandra, we may have a timeline problem that needs federal attention before tonight." A sharp intake of breath. "How serious?" "Serious enough that I need you moving in the next 10 minutes. "I'm moving," she said, and he heard her already in motion, footsteps, a door. "Stay where you are. Don't go outside until I call you back. Don't—" "I know," he said. "I know, Sandra. Make the call." He sat at the back table of a small coffee shop on Vander and 51st and put his phone on the table and watched the door and the windows and listened to his own heartbeat, doing its slow, heavy work in his chest. And outside the city moved with its great indifferent velocity, and somewhere in it a man named Curtis Avery was retaining a specific professional purpose, and Grayson Vale, who had walked away from every true thing in his life in pursuit of a room where the real decisions were made, was now sitting in a coffee shop waiting for his attorney to activate federal protection while holding two pieces of information that could bring down one of the most powerful families in the state. His phone buzzed. "Sandra. Briggs is making calls. Stay put. Federal marshals in 20 minutes. He exhaled, long and slow, all the way down to the bottom. He picked up the coffee he hadn't ordered yet, walked to the counter, paid for a cup, and sat back down. 18 minutes later, two marshals in plain clothes walked through the door, and the one on the left looked at him directly and gave a single nod, and Grayson nodded back, and the morning outside kept going, the way mornings do, entirely without regard for what is happening inside the buildings it passes. His phone buzzed one more time. Not Sandra. Not Preston. A number he hadn't saved but recognized immediately, the same way you recognize certain faces even after years of distance, with your whole body before your mind catches up. Elena. A text, not a call. 4 words. "Marcus Fielding called me." His chest tightened. He typed back immediately. "Are you somewhere safe right now? 3 seconds. 5, 10. The typing indicator appeared. The typing indicator appeared and then stopped. Appeared again. Stopped. Grayson was already on his feet. The marshal on the left, the one who'd nodded, was named Reyes, and he moved to block the door with a speed that was quiet and professional and completely without drama. "Sir, stay seated." "Someone may have contacted my—" Grayson stopped, reorganized. "There's a woman. She's not part of the case, but Ashcroft's people reached out to her this morning. I need to know she's safe." Reyes looked at his partner, a wordless exchange of about half a second. "Give me the address." Elena's text came through while Grayson was giving Reyes the clinic address. 3 words. "I'm at work." He typed, "Stay there. Don't leave with anyone. Federal marshals are coming to you. This is real. Please trust me on this one thing." A long pause. Then, "Okay." Just that. 1 word and the specific weight it carried. Not warmth, not forgiveness, just the pragmatic cooperation of a woman who had survived enough to know when a situation required setting everything else aside. Landed in his chest with more force than anything had in a long time. Reyes was on his radio. His partner stayed at the door. The coffee shop around them continued its morning with magnificent indifference. The counter woman refilling a regular's cup, someone's phone playing a weather forecast too loud. Sandra called 6 minutes later. "Briggs has eyes on Avery. He was picked up for questioning 20 minutes ago outside a parking structure 3 blocks from your building. They're holding him on a related warrant. Old case, outstanding matter, sufficient to get him off the street while they build the current picture." Her voice was controlled but moving fast. Preston Ashcroft surrendered to federal authorities at 8:15 a.m., voluntary, brought his own counsel. "He's in with Briggs right now." Grayson sat back down. "Clifford. Clifford's attorney have been notified. He's at the family estate in Westchester. They're not moving on him until the evidentiary picture is complete, but he's not going anywhere." A pause. "We need you in this afternoon. The proffer signing can't wait." "I know. Elena Rowan, the clinic on Foster Street. I need confirmation she's secure. Reyes already called it in. 2 agents on their way. Another pause, this one different in quality. Grayson, you did the right thing this morning. Going to meet Preston was not the right thing for the record, but what came out of it was. So. Noted. 2 p.m., my office. Don't be late, and don't make any more independent decisions before then. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and the 2 marshals doing their quiet professional thing around the edges of the room and outside the windows. The morning was becoming midday, the light shifting, the city moving through its gears. He thought about Preston walking into a federal building with his own attorney at 8:15 in the morning. The image had a specific texture. The man who had watched every room for reactions, who had folded his hands and counted costs and built towards something on a patient, invisible timeline, walking through a federal door and accepting what that meant for his daughters and his position and his name. Grayson didn't feel triumphant about it. He felt something more complicated and less satisfying, the way you feel when a thing that needed to happen finally happens and the necessity of it doesn't make it clean. He finished his coffee. It had gone cold. The proffer agreement was signed at 2:17 p.m. in Sandra's conference room with a federal notary present and Briggs attending by phone. It was 11 pages. Grayson read every word, which Sandra had expected, and asked 4 clarifying questions, which Briggs had apparently also expected because he answered them without impatience. The pension fund prioritization language was in paragraph 8, clear and unambiguous. Grayson initialed it specifically. When it was done, he sat for a moment with the pen still in his hand and felt the specific quality of a door closing. Not relief, not satisfaction. The sound a heavy door makes when the latch engages, definitive and slightly final. The federal case against Ashcroft Capital moved quickly after that, in the way that cases move quickly when multiple cooperating witnesses are providing consistent accounts from different positions inside the same organization. Preston's testimony covered the Voss arrangement and the Phase 1 political corruption layer with the specificity that Briggs described to Sandra as unusually comprehensive. Thomas Greer, the server administrator, was interviewed and confirmed the credential manipulation, had been pressured to do it by Marcus Fielding directly, had documentation of the instruction, had kept it for exactly the same reason Voss had kept his, insurance, in an organization where everyone eventually understood that the insurance policies were what kept you ambulatory. Marcus Fielding did not cooperate. He retained 4 attorneys and said nothing and remained professionally silent through every stage of the proceedings, which was his right, and which ultimately served him poorly because what the other witnesses provided was sufficient to frame his role with considerable precision regardless of his participation. Clifford Ashcroft was indicted on 6 counts 11 weeks after the proffer signing. He made bail, was photographed leaving the courthouse in a suit that still cost more than most people's monthly rent, and said nothing to the reporters assembled outside beyond a brief prepared statement about his confidence in the judicial process. He was 71 years old, and he looked in the photographs exactly like what he was. A man who had operated for 50 years in the belief that his particular kind of intelligence placed him beyond the reach of certain consequences, confronting the evidence that it hadn't. Vivian issued a public statement through her attorneys, expressing cooperation with authorities and distancing herself from the specific financial structures under examination. She was not indicted. There was not sufficient evidence of her direct knowledge of the fraud mechanics, and her cooperation, such as it was, which was limited and precisely calibrated, was accepted. She did not contact Grayson again. He didn't expect her to and found, when he thought about it, that he had very little left to say to her. What she had been was clear. What he had been in relation to her was equally clear. Neither picture reflected well, and there was nothing in the clarity that required a conversation. The Meridian development was frozen by court order. The Holloway acquisition collapsed. The municipal pension fund recovery was initiated as a priority in the asset seizure proceedings, which did not make the Pattersons whole and did not undo 11 days in November when they had lost a house they'd lived in for 22 years, but meant something. Imperfect, partial, inadequate, and real. Grayson's bar hearing took place on a Thursday in February, 8 months after the proffer agreement. He didn't dress up for it the way some people dress up for proceedings they're hoping to survive. The performative show of respect that reads as desperation. He wore the same charcoal suit he'd worn to Clifford Ashcroft's dinner table, which was a choice he didn't fully explain to himself until afterward, when he understood that he'd wanted to wear the suit that had been present at the moment of his worst decision as a reminder of what the day was actually about. He didn't contest the findings, didn't perform contrition in the theatrical way that sometimes works in these rooms. When asked to speak, he said clearly and without prepared remarks, "I made choices that harmed people I never met and will likely never meet. The legal framework I built was designed to obscure that harm, which means I understood the harm was there. I don't have a better explanation than that I chose advancement over accountability and then spent considerable effort not looking directly at what that choice meant." He paused. "I'm not asking for a particular outcome. I'm telling you what's true." His license was suspended for 18 months. Not revoked. Sandra had navigated the cooperation credit with precision, but suspended, which meant he would eventually be able to practice again, in some form, if he chose to, if the board approved reinstatement after the term. He walked out of the hearing into February air that was sharp and clean and stood on the steps for a moment with his hands in his pockets. Harold Pitts was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Grayson stopped when he saw him. Harold looked smaller than he remembered, or maybe just older. The last year had moved through everyone differently. They looked at each other for a moment. "You didn't have to come," Grayson said. "I know." Harold put his hands in his own pockets. "How'd it go?" 18 months. A nod. Harold looked down at the steps, then back up. "Are you all right?" Grayson thought about the question. "Working on it," he said, which was the most honest answer available. Harold reached out and put a hand briefly on his shoulder, the grip of an older man, dry and firm and entirely without agenda, and then let go and said, "Come by the office sometime, not for work, just for coffee." He paused. "I meant what I said at your farewell lunch, even the things I didn't say out loud." He walked away down the street, and Grayson stood on the steps and watched him go, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight for a very long time. He started working at the Rowan Community Legal Clinic 6 months later. Not as an attorney, his suspension made that impossible, and would have made it awkward regardless, but as an intake coordinator and paralegal assistant, a role that had a starting salary that was a number he had not thought about since his first year as an associate, and that he accepted without negotiation, because negotiating would have misunderstood the nature of what he was trying to do. He'd called the clinic's main line and asked to speak with whoever handled volunteer administration, and a young man named Terrence had answered and walked him through the application process. And Grayson had completed it on his kitchen table that same evening, and 2 weeks later he had shown up at 7:45 a.m. with a coffee from the shop on the corner because he didn't know what else to bring. Elena had known he was coming. She'd approved the application herself, which he understood only in retrospect when Terrence mentioned it offhand in the 3rd week. She hadn't told him. She'd simply been at her desk when he arrived, as she always was, and she'd looked up from her paperwork and looked at him standing in the doorway, and something moved across her face that he couldn't name, not welcome, not hostility, something in the middle distance between them that acknowledged what he was there and what he was not. "Terrence will show you where everything is," she said. "Okay," he said. That was the entirety of their first conversation in 14 months. He went and found Terrence. The work was not glamorous. Intake interviews with people navigating eviction proceedings, employment disputes, child custody frameworks that the family court system had made complicated in ways that the people inside them couldn't always parse. Paperwork, filing, answering phones, accompanying supervising attorneys to preliminary hearings as a support function, sitting in the back of courtrooms he'd once operated in at a completely different altitude, and following the proceedings with the full professional attention he brought to everything, now in service of a family in row 2 instead of a corporation with offshore subsidiaries. I was good at the intake work, which didn't surprise him. He was trained to listen to how people described their situations and identify what was legally relevant underneath the emotional narration, and he did that now without the layer of strategic positioning that had previously accompanied it. He just listened. He took notes. He made sure the supervising attorney had what they needed to do the job. He and Elena developed a working relationship the way people who have a complicated history develop professional norms, carefully, with unspoken agreements about perimeter and pace. She was direct in the way she'd always been direct. No unnecessary warmth and no unnecessary coldness. Just the specific quality of a woman who had fully processed what had happened to her and decided, without drama, that she was not going to allow it to govern her posture toward the world. She ran the clinic with the same intelligence and the same organizational stubbornness she had always brought to everything, and the clinic's reputation in the community reflected it. The caseload had tripled since she'd taken over the directorship. The funding had expanded, the staff had grown to 8 full-time attorneys, and a rotating roster of law students who competed for the limited slots. She had built something real. He watched it every day and understood, without needing to say it, that she had built it during the same period he had been constructing the architecture of his own destruction. He met his son for the first time on a Sunday in April. Elena had arranged it with an intermediary quality that was neither warm nor hostile, a practical acknowledgement that the child was going to have a father in the world, and that managing that reality cleanly was better than managing it badly. She brought him to a park, a good park, with a wide open space and ducks on a pond, and she sat on a bench with a book she wasn't actually reading while Grayson sat on the grass and met a 14-month-old boy named Marcus. She'd named him before the Ashcroft situation. He understood. The name was coincidence, and also a kind of irony the universe had apparently decided to supply. Who looked at him with the specific, fearless curiosity of a child who has been well loved and therefore approaches strangers without the armor that children without that safety sometimes carry early. The boy had Elena's eyes. He also had Grayson's hands, which was a detail that hit Grayson in the sternum with a force he wasn't prepared for. He sat in the grass for an hour and a half, while Marcus investigated a series of sticks and rocks, and eventually decided that Grayson's shoelaces were worth sustained attention. And Grayson sat very still and let him work at the laces and looked at the top of his son's head, the fine dark hair, the concentrated downturn of his brow that was so specifically Elena's expression that it made Grayson's throat tighten, and understood, in a way that was physical and complete and beyond the reach of any box or compartment, what he had walked away from on a night 14 months ago when he'd signed papers across a kitchen table and driven toward a glittering skyline with the radio on. Elena walked over at some point, stood beside him looking down at the boy, who had successfully untied one shoe and was regarding the loose lace with profound satisfaction. "He's like that with everything," she said. "He commits completely." "He gets that from you?" She was quiet for a moment. "He's going to have questions eventually. About you. About what happened. I know. I'm going to tell him the truth. When he's old enough. All of it. I want you to." She looked at him then. A direct, measured look. The full candle power version that she'd always been capable of, and that he'd always found slightly difficult to hold. "I don't need you to be sorry, Grayson. Sorry doesn't rebuild anything. What I need to know is whether you understand what you're here for. Not for me. Not to repair something between us, because that's not what this is. But for him." She indicated Marcus with a slight movement of her head. "Whether you can show up consistently and honestly for someone who didn't choose any of this." "Yes," he said. "That's what I'm here for." She studied him for another moment. Whatever she found in his face, she accepted it without comment, which was not the same as approval, but was the beginning of something functional. She went back to the bench. He turned back to his son, who had moved on from the shoelace to a small, smooth stone and was holding it up toward the sky as if presenting it for examination. Grayson took the stone when the boy held it out to him, looked at it seriously, handed it back. Marcus laughed, a full, uncomplicated sound, and threw the stone into the grass and immediately forgot about it and started moving toward the pond with the purposeful, slightly unsteady locomotion of a child who has recently become confident in walking but hasn't yet negotiated with the concept of terrain. Grayson got up and followed him. The federal trial of Clifford Ashcroft concluded the following October. 6 counts, guilty on 4. The sentencing was covered by the financial press in considerable detail. 3 years, minimum security, substantial fines, asset seizure that the recovery administrators calculated at approximately 62% sufficient to cover the pension fund exposure. Not complete. Not clean. 62% of the damage addressed, which meant 38% of the damage, remained as a number on a spreadsheet and a reality in the lives of people who had been expecting something to be there when they needed it and found it reduced. Grayson read the sentencing coverage at his desk at the clinic on a Thursday morning before anyone else arrived. He read it straight through without looking away from any of it. Marcus Fielding had received a separate sentencing on a reduced cooperation plea, 18 months. Raymond Voss, the alderman, had received full immunity in exchange for testimony and was living in Scottsdale with whatever he'd managed to keep. Preston Ashcroft had received a suspended sentence and 5 years probation, which was the fruit of his cooperation and the specific, particular decision he'd made in a coffee shop on Vander and 51st to walk through a federal door before his father had the opportunity to manage the situation differently. Grayson had not spoken to Preston since that morning. He expected he never would again, and felt about that nothing particularly complicated. Preston had made a decision at the edge of something unforgivable and pulled back, and that was what it was. Not heroism, not redemption, just a man locating a line he wasn't willing to cross and stopping before he crossed it. There was nothing in that requiring Grayson's ongoing assessment. Vivian he did not think about often. When he did, he thought about her with a clarity that had replaced whatever he'd once felt. Not bitterness, which would have implied she'd taken something from him, but a recognition of his own specific vulnerability, the precise shape of what he'd wanted badly enough to stop asking the questions he should have asked. She had offered him a mirror showing the version of himself he'd been trying to construct, and he had looked at that mirror and made decisions based on it, and the fault of those decisions was not hers. He passed his bar reinstatement hearing 18 months to the day after the suspension. He was reinstated with conditions, annual reporting requirements, a supervised practice period, restrictions on certain categories of corporate work that he had no intention of pursuing regardless. He walked out of the reinstatement hearing and called Sandra, who said, "Congratulations," in a voice that was matter-of-fact and warm in equal measure, and then said, "Don't do anything stupid this time," and hung up before he could respond, which was very like her and which made him smile for the first time that day. He went back to the clinic. He'd talked with Elena about it, whether he should return as an attorney or whether the institutional awkwardness was too much. She'd thought about it for a day and come back to him with the same practical directness she brought to everything. "We need the capacity," she said. "And you know how this work operates. So yes, you can come back. But you report to Diane, the senior supervising attorney, same as anyone else. I'm not your supervisor, I'm the director. If that's workable for you, fine." "That's workable," he said. "Then we'll see you Monday." He came back Monday. The work was what the work had always been. The Pattersons of the world. The people for whom the legal system was a labyrinth designed by someone who had never needed to navigate it themselves. The families facing impossible choices with inadequate information and no resources to close the gap. He worked those cases the way he'd always worked everything, with total focus, with the specific intelligence that had made Harold Pitt say, "You have something that can't be taught," but without the performance, without the layer of strategy aimed at something beyond the case in front of him. Just the case. Just the people. Just the problem and the available tools and the honest effort to close the distance between what was fair and what was happening. He was not at peace, exactly. Peace implied a finished quality he didn't think he'd earned. He was someone who had done significant damage and was doing the daily, non-dramatic work of understanding what that meant in practice, which was not grand gestures or public contrition, but small, consistent choices, the accumulation of which might eventually mean something to the boy with his hands and Elena's eyes, who was growing up in a world that would eventually require him to make sense of who his father had been. That was the work. Not the legal work, the other work, the daily internal work of being someone who had seen himself clearly, without the mirror Vivian had offered, and without the boxes he'd built to manage the view, and was choosing, every day, to act from what he'd seen rather than from what he'd wanted to be. It wasn't glamorous. There were no private jets, no penthouse views, no rooms where the real decisions were made by the real people. There was a desk with a lamp and a caseload, and the specific sound of the clinic in the morning, phones and voices, and the particular energy of a place that is genuinely trying to do something in the world. And on some mornings, Elena walked past his door on her way to her own office, and sometimes she glanced in and sometimes she didn't. And on the mornings she did, there was something in that glance that was not warmth and was not coldness, but was the complicated middle thing that real people carry when the history is long and the accounting is still ongoing. He didn't ask for more than that. He didn't think he had the right to ask for more than that. Sunday afternoons at the park became a consistent thing, then a routine, then the kind of unremarkable rhythm that children build their sense of the world from. Marcus, who at 2.5 had a vocabulary that suggested Elena's reading program was already bearing fruit, had taken to bringing Grayson specific objects for inspection. Rocks, primarily, but also a bottle cap. Once an entire dead beetle that Grayson examined with complete seriousness and declared impressive, which produced the full candle power laugh. Elena watched from the bench with her book that she sometimes actually read. They didn't talk much during these afternoons. There wasn't much that needed saying. The shape of the thing was what it was. A child running in Sunday light, two adults with a complicated history sitting at a careful distance, and the ongoing, unglamorous real work of being present for someone who needed it. One Sunday in late autumn, when the light had gone gold and the temperature had dropped enough that Marcus wore a small red jacket with a hood that Elena had to regularly replace on his head because he kept pulling it off, the boy walked over to Grayson and without preamble climbed into his lap and sat there looking at the pond with the solemn proprietary ease of a child who has decided something and not bothered to announce the decision. Grayson sat very still, kept his breathing even. Across the park, Elena looked up from her book. She looked at the two of them for a long moment, her son in her ex-husband's lap, regarding the ducks with executive authority. Her face did the complicated thing it did. Then she looked back at her book. The ducks moved across the water. The light did what late autumn light does in the late afternoon. That slow gold going amber, going the color of something you can't name that's part warmth and part loss and entirely fleeting. Marcus pointed at the ducks and said something in the half-formed language of a child still negotiating the gap between intention and vocabulary, and Grayson said, "Yeah, I see them." And the boy seemed satisfied by this and settled more firmly into his lap and continued his supervision of the pond. The afternoon moved around them. The light changed. The ducks went about their indifferent business. Some things don't recover. Some things shouldn't. The marriage was gone, and what had existed between Grayson and Elena in the good years, the 4-hour first date, the Sunday cooking, the honest small life they'd built together, was not recoverable, and the attempt to recover it would have been its own dishonesty, a sentimental revision of a history that had what it had in it and needed to be left as what it was. Elena had chosen a future built on her own foundation without the weight of his choices dragging behind her, and that choice was the most fully herself thing she had ever done, and he understood it and accepted it, and was, in the precise and unglamorous way of a man learning to want the right things, grateful for it. What remained was a Sunday afternoon, a child with his hands in her eyes, pointing at ducks, the daily work of showing up honestly and consistently for someone who hadn't chosen any of it. The clinic and the cases and the people who needed someone to close the gap between what was fair and what was happening. That was what he had. It was real, which was not nothing, which was in fact considerably more than he'd had when he'd been driving toward skylines with the radio on, certain he'd won something. He hadn't won anything. But here, in the gold light, with his son in his lap and the ducks on the water, and the distance between himself and Elena managed at the precise and honest remove that was all either of them could offer, he was, for the first time in a very long time, not running from anything. The light held for another half hour. Then it changed, the way light always does, indifferent and beautiful and completely without regard for the people inside it. And Elena closed her book and stood and called Marcus's name in the voice she used when the afternoon was ending. And the boy climbed down from Grayson's lap with the same decisive lack of ceremony with which he'd climbed up, and trotted toward his mother. Grayson stayed on the bench for another moment, looked at the pond. Then he got up, put his hands in his pockets, and walked toward the parking lot in the amber light of an ordinary Sunday in a city that had never cared about him, in a life that was smaller and truer than anything he had chased, and it was enough. It was, finally, enough.